Hi, Alice.
Hi, Narina.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And where are you right now?
I'm in Mexico City.
And what are you working on right now?
I'm working on research of the Mexican elite and their perceptions of inequality.
Why Mexico and why the elites?
Okay, that's two important questions. In Mexico, because I know the context fairly well and I have access points to the elites. And that's a very important question when you do elite research because they are usually not as easy to access. Why I think elites are important? Because in terms of inequality, it's important to not only look at the bottom, but also look at the top of the distribution, particularly because the elites, the very high parts of the income distribution, have a lot of power, potential power to change inequality.
What approach did you use?
The approach I took for this research was to interview and observe, as a kind of participant observer, about 45 members of the elite. That is, as I defined it in this research, the top 0.5% of the income distribution and the person in a position of potential power. This is very important because not only do they have to have high income to be elite, but also have some other source of capital as wealth or political power or intellectual power. So some of the people that I interviewed were academics or media people or other celebrities.
Speaking about elites, are there differences between countries?
Yes, there are. So the reason why I chose Mexico, besides my access to the elites, is that it's a very unequal country. So it's kind of representative for many emerging countries or countries, middle-income countries that have very high inequalities. So while all cases are special, and of course this is a very particular situation and it's probably not all comparable to other countries, there might be some interesting things that could be said about elites in general in high inequality middle-income countries.
What result did you get?
In my research, I found that people that are very affluent might still believe that they're not as affluent compared to their even more affluent peers. So while they acknowledge that they're privileged compared to the poor, they don't actually feel that rich compared to their peers. So somebody that was selected purposefully to be part of the 1% or 0.5% top income group actually feels that they belong to the 6th, 7th, 8th decile of the income distribution. And that's quite surprising because they might know that they are in the top decile, so not the top percent or top decile, so top 10% of the income distribution, but that they would think that they're probably in the 60s to 70% of the income distribution. That's actually quite low. So what it means, elites would place themselves lower in the income distribution, is that they have a different view of what inequality looks like than what academic studies show.
Why is it this way?
Yeah, so one of the things, of course, that I had to start looking at was why do people perceive inequality so differently when they're in this top part? And the possibilities of why were they're ignorant or they're lying or they're just not aware of what's going on. And it turns out that none of these really, another explanation that they're conspiring and they're just don't care about the rest of society. Actually, none of these explanations were very convincing empirically or theoretically. And what instead seems to make a lot more sense was that these people, because of the way that they live secluded with their social environment, make judgments about society and about inequality based on their personal social environment. So, for example, one person told me that, of course, he had enough money to get by, but he didn't have a private jet, so he wasn't really that super wealthy as his friends were. If you don't have a private jet, your two fancy cars might not seem so special anymore.
Does education help to reduce inequality?
Yeah, that's the very important point, that institutions that you would think might be egalitarian or might foment equality actually don't work that way if you look at them in the specific context here. And that has something to do with the fact that you have a bifurcated system of education where you have public education that is not regarded as very high quality, even where it is, and private education, which is very expensive and sometimes high quality and sometimes not. But so what happens is that because private education has a higher prestige, people will go to private education if they can. And there are some specific private education institutions that are kind of reserved, let's say, for very high income individuals because the cost of attending them is so high and because sometimes you need connections to be able to get in. So what happens is that people that are in this very small group of being able to access these education institutions will remain amongst their peers because people that cannot afford it, that is, people that have lower incomes, will not be able to go to these institutions. So in these places, especially at the universities, but also even in secondary schools and probably even earlier, there's a certain selectivity. You will already meet the people that probably will be important later on, and that have more power, that have more wealth, that have more income, that are for some reason important or have potential influence, and you will become friends with them. So when you leave school or university, you will already have a network of well-connected people that can further increase your wealthy environment or further separate you from the rest of society, if you will.
How important is race, or how important is money, or what does it mean to be elite in Mexico?
So one participant specifically said that racism used to be more important, and today classism is more important to distinguish between individuals and in groups in Mexico. This is something that I cannot verify whether that's a general truth, but that was the experience of that individual. That being said, both classism and racism is very prevalent. And one of the interesting points kind of proving that is that except for two individuals that self-identified as brown, all other members were white. And in general, it can be said that to be part of an elite, it's almost necessary to be white. And there are exceptions, that's true, but most of the elite is quite light, fair-skinned, blonde, maybe some even, which was also an important factor for me to get access because I am white and blonde. So they saw me as a peer, even though I was not actually part of.
How did the people you interviewed react?
So when I started this research, I was a little bit worried that I might not actually have enough people that I could access, or that I would not get enough information, or that elite members, as I imagined them, would be very reluctant to talk about issues like inequality, poverty, power, challenging their privilege. And what I found was actually quite surprising that people are very open to talk about it. And actually, even more surprising, we're very worried about inequality. And that might have something to do with the specific context here, that inequality is very high. And individuals generally think that it's too high. All participants think that inequality is too high here, which is quite surprising for what I expected at the outset. But I found people to be very keen on talking about these topics. And I think it has something to do with the fact that people are worried about other problems that they connect with inequality, such as the high crime rate, the violence in the country, corruption, poverty, all kind of very big issues that people are concerned about, and they might understand in some way or another, but they link them to inequality.
What kind of solutions did they imagine?
Many participants believe that if education is increased for everybody, or the access to education, that would solve the problem of inequality. And I have told you that educational institutions can actually foment inequality under the circumstances that we have. So I don't think that's a sufficient solution for getting rid of inequality. Nonetheless, most participants proposed, besides education, only poverty relief. And when specifically asked about policies like tax or other redistributional questions, they said, yeah, that would be okay. I would be willing to pay more taxes, but then I would have to know that they will be implemented in a way that is acceptable. So there is a very strong linkage between policies proposed or favored and the mistrust in, let's say, public institutions in general.
What are your conclusions after this research?
It seems that the fact that people live in different worlds, of course, everybody has their own perception, but when there are specific groups that align according to lines of difference, so elites with themselves and poor people amongst themselves, it's very difficult to be empathetic and to relate to other parts of the population or other subgroups. So in order to change the situation and to improve understanding of other groups, I think it is important to create spaces where people can interact. So desegregate along socioeconomic lines, urban life, for example. So I think it's important to have places where people can meet, public spaces that people use, deprivatize many situations or many spaces, social spaces that are used primarily by specific groups. And many people do things because they're not aware of others, let's say. So when we make them aware of others, there's a chance that they will actually understand them better. That specifically, that experience I had in many of the interviews where people said, well, I've never really thought about that. Makes a lot of sense. So people are actually very sensible. It's not that they're ignorant or evil. But when you're not exposed to other people's realities, you might have difficulties relating to them. So when we have spaces to interact, I believe that it will be easier to relate to other people and thus wish for them to be better off as well.
Probably we will always live in an unequal world, but when would it be equal enough?
It's a very difficult question.
Yes, I know.
Thank you. I think that as long as there are people suffering from lack of fulfillment of basic conditions, it's definitely not a situation that is acceptable for a society, especially for fairly wealthy societies. And Mexico is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. However, it is so poorly distributed that half of the population is poor. And under circumstances where people suffer, where they don't have enough to eat, where they don't have shelter, it's definitely not a situation where we can say it's acceptable to have billionaires, even if they're just a few. So, of course, not everybody needs to have exactly the same income because there are differences in priorities, there are differences in needs, there are differences in taste or incentives, whichever you want to use as the category. So it's okay to have some differences, but it's not okay to have people that don't have enough to be covering their basic needs.
And what do you think that we need more in order to find a better direction?
A better world.
Yes.
Obviously, as a researcher, I will tell you that first thing we need is better data, which is somewhat selfish maybe because I will collect the data, hope to collect some more data. There is definitely a data issue where the numbers that you have are so unreliable that very rich individuals don't even show up in the survey results. It's very difficult to have reliable numbers and to actually understand what the situation looks like, really. Elites have traditionally and also by definition had the privilege or the ability to seclude themselves from being scrutinized. Research like this can only be the starting point for understanding really what dynamics look at the very extremes of the distribution, being that the poor or the rich. The poor have been investigated a lot more, also because it's a bit easier to get access. And also because the priority was a lot on figuring out what's going on at the bottom, and then that would resolve the problem. But as it turns out, it doesn't. And the very rich have a very strong influence on how inequality looks like. They also have the potential power to change it. So it's very important, I think, to understand not only what is going on there, but also to propose solutions that include them, that affect them, but also include them, so that they can actually be practically implemented.
Do you see it after these interviews? Do you have the impression that something could change?
I think this is a, let's say, historically strategic moment in the sense that there is a lot of talk about inequality, especially in the wealthy countries, but even in countries like Mexico and other countries, it's actually a topic that is very high on the agenda. And that is something that can be used to improve the distribution because people are more aware of it than they were in the last couple of decades, and because there are much better numbers now, even though I complain that they're not good enough, but they're better than they used to be. So it's a very good moment to propose changes to improve the income distribution. There is also a very strong belief, even amongst the elites, that inequality is getting too high, so that there is willingness to do something about it.
If you could change something, if you had the power to do it and the money, what would you like to change?
I think there are several things that are needed, and they address all different areas. It's a very complex problem, inequality, and thus it cannot have a very simple solution, unfortunately. But there are a couple of things that can be done that would definitely help, and there's, let's say, empirical proof from other situations or other countries or other times in history. And one thing is definitely the tax system or the tax structure. High income people should be taxed proportionately. So let's say have more progressive tax structures than you have in the country at the moment. You probably would have to implement a wealth tax as well. There are lots of tax issues that would help to improve inequality. At the same time, it's useful to address issues of wages in general, because wages continue to be the highest income source for most individuals, even at the fairly high part of the income distribution. So things like minimum wages at the low end, but probably you could even consider maximum wages for some very high paid positions, or restrictions to boni in specific situations, or, so there's different options what you could do with top income taxes, with wealth taxes, with labor policies and fiscal policies in general. There's one more. There is another policy that I think would improve the income distribution, which is something like a basic income, or an unconditional basic income. If you pay everybody enough to sustain themselves or enough to survive, you can argue about the level that the income should be. It's less important to compete over incomes, and it's probably changing the approach that people would have to paid work. So I think it would be a very important policy to improve the income distribution.
Was there a moment that surprised you?
Yes, there were several. Okay. I'd have to... Which one would surprise you most? There was one situation where a participant, after the interview, became very emotional and started thanking me. And I didn't understand why she would thank me. And she said it's because it changed her perception of the topic, because she had never thought about it like that. And there was even another participant who started crying in an interview because he got so emotional about the situation. And these things were not expected. Not because my participants were particularly emotional, but that was something that surprised me as a reaction to being confronted with situations that they hadn't thought about, maybe.
But this means that we have really to get to know each other and to learn more about other people, right?
Yes, that's one of the takeaway points for me. The reason why I strongly believe in people being able to change when they see the other's reality is because that is my experience in this research, that very few people, after being confronted with numbers of poor or the real dimension of inequality, would say, oh, well, I guess I don't care. Actually, people are quite empathetic. Of course, there are exceptions, and I'm sure that there are many people also that are not as open about these things. But in general, in my experience, people were quite willing to empathize with other people once they knew about their reality. So one of the most frequent answers, especially from private sector participants, was, I didn't know it was that level, or I didn't know it was that bad, let's say.
And Alice, and what's next for you?
I am still quite interested in this research about the elites and their perceptions, because I think there are still a lot of things that we don't know about the elites and their perceptions and everybody's perceptions. I would very much like to compare the situation here to that of other countries or other contexts and see whether there are generalities, whether this is something that can be said about all situations, which I don't believe, or whether there are some parts that can be generalized and others that are very specifically context dependent. So I would like to do some comparative research about elites in different places. And then probably after some time of looking at the elites, I want to look at something else again.
Alice, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Irina. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, and speak to you soon again.
I hope we speak soon.
Bye, Alice.
Bye bye.